Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. I just want to get everybody set in the mood. Are you guys with your blankie? Do you have your herbal tea, or your coffee, or your other wine? Anything else that makes you relaxed and comfortable? Get ready in your PJs. It looks like in the last chapters we met Vivian, who is a medium, like myself. She deals specifically with ghosts and helping them cross over. It's a little bit different than my work, but same. It's kind of the same. So we're going to begin chapter 7 again. I don't know how many chapters we're going to do. It's looking like about 3 chapters per video, so it's about an hour. So the only thing I'm asking is that you guys like, share, subscribe if you like this. To kind of give me some feedback if we're going to do if we're liking this, if we're liking the way we're doing this. So, let's get started. Chapter 7. The sunshine glinted off the arch window of the Royal Agency. The rays of light did little to improve the grim stone facade and the iron gate separating the building from the crowded streets. I stood in front of the bars and pulled my cloak tighter around my body. A chilly wind carried brittle leaves through the air and numbed my exposed fingers while I gathered the courage to go inside. Excuse me. Ella had vanished before dawn, and I remained at Vivian's trying to get a few hours of sleep. Not that it did any good. I tossed and turned, plagued with nightmares that dissipated like smoke when I opened my eyes. The plans we'd made in the dark felt flawed in the daylight. Yeah, I kind of had that feeling. Good morning, Miss Daniels. Are you here to see Detective Chambers? I located the voice, spotted Abrams walking towards the entrance. He rubbed his bloodshot eyes, a sign his night shifts were taking a toll. His uniform was wrinkled yet clean. He tugged the cap from his head, twisted the brim of his hands as he gave a weak smile. Yes, I need to speak to him about my fines. Abrams nodded and leaned closer, lowering his tone. He's a stickler when it comes to the law, but I'm surprised he came down so hard on you. Otherwise, others would have turned a blind eye. You don't say. Irritation shot up my spine. What was it about me that made Derrick so prickly? I'd never met anyone who ran as hot and cold as he did. One minute he was laying on the charm, the next he was accusing me of being a charlatan. Abrams grew serious and furrowed his brow. About last night, I shouldn't have revealed so much as I did. It's not a good trait for an aspired detective. I appreciate it if you didn't let Detective Chambers know. He'll have my head. A flush colored the tip of his ears, a mixture of embarrassment and the cold. I realized we were both a little intimidated by the man. Luckily for him, I needed every ally I could get. I needed every ally. Excuse me. I needed every ally I could get. And if keeping secrets from Derrick was our common ground, I'd take it. Your secret is safe with me. We wouldn't want to darken his mood any more than it already is. No, we wouldn't want that. Abrams chuckled and pushed open the gate, making the iron bars whine in protest. He gestured for me to go first. I swallowed my nerve and climbed the stone staircase. Inside, a narrow hallway opened into a waiting area. The room teemed with people. Shouts competing for control echoed into the rafters as a pair of angry merchants fought over stolen merchandise. Their fingers jabbed the air, the inches from a street urchin's smirking face. The kid polished an apple on his threadbare jacket, then crunched it his jagged with his jagged teeth through the fruit. It was a defiant gesture, one that sent merchants lunging for the ferruled apple. Abrams nudged me past the commotion towards the wide desk that served as the entry point to the back offices. A silver-haired woman glanced up from a ledger. Her stern features broke into a grin when she spotted Abrams. Her eyes crinkled around the edges. Oh. Morning, Estelle. Abrams leaned an elbow on her desk and returned a flirtatious smile. And how is my favorite gatekeeper today? Keeping the riffraff in line? Estelle preened and smoothed a lock of hair that had slipped from her bun. I do what I can. I glanced at the eluded riffraff, none of whom were in line. Abrams feigned arrogance, unconcerned by the chaos. Is Detective Chambers in his office? He's finishing up a meeting. You can go back and wait. He flashed her another smile, then ushered me down the hallway. We passed doors on both sides, with muffled sound leaking from beneath the frames. I walked slowly, each step twisting the knot in my stomach. My plans sifted in my mind, becoming less appealing by the second. What if he did have me committed? I ground to a halt, but it was too late. Abrams had stopped and was holding open the office door. I peered inside, unsurprised by the clean, utilitarian atmosphere. A massive desk sat along one wall, its surface void of personal effects. Instead, papers were stacked and ordered in strict line, and a tin plate disclosing Derrick's prestigious title had been polished and glistening sheen. I inspected his bookcase, running my index fingers along the shelf as he had done to mine. It came away clean, not a speck of dust. Pardon me. Detective Chambers certainly likes order, I mused, frowning when I noticed the titles had been shelved alphabetically. I'd never sorted anything alphabetically in my life. The stark difference in our personalities was on full display. Maybe it wasn't a good strategy to tell a man who was such a pragmatist that I could see his murder victim's ghost. I might as well put the straitjacket on myself. Abram scratched the morning stubble covering his jaw. He likes things a certain way. Function and discipline are key. He paused, but whatever memory clouded his features vanished at the sound of the scuffle from the hallway. Someone grunted, followed by the dense thud of a fist meeting flesh. Wait here. He indicated a chair in front of Derrick's desk. I obeyed as Abram slipped from the office, closing the door behind him. The disturbance escalated, and slurred voices echoed in the hall before going quiet. A minute passed, then two. My gaze darted over at the desk, and my hands faded neatly in my lap. The urge to snoop intensified. If we were keeping score, Derrick had snooped through my things first. He might have had the tedious fact of probable cause on his side, but I had reason too, curiosity. I checked the door, making certain it was firmly closed, then scooted closer to the desk. Numerous cases formed in stacked piles, robberies, assaults, and a handful of missing people, but nothing on Ella's investigation. I thumbed through the papers just to be sure. A door slammed in the hall. The jarring sound made me knock a stack of folders onto the floor. Cursing, I slid to my knees and scooped up the scattered documents. They were out of order, but figuring out Derrick's filing system looked impossible. I arranged them as best as I could, then noticed one I'd missed. Pushing his chair aside, I crawled under the desk, stretching my fingers to snag the corner of the file. Ugh! My forehead smacked the blunt object protruding from the desk. I hissed in a breath and reached for the evil contraption, running my fingers along the dull edges. No buttons, no holes. Whatever was inside was self-contained. I was about to pull away when I felt a small groove where the wood met the desktop. Wrapping my fingers around the narrow chamber, I slid it forward. Something cold and metal dropped into my palm. A key. Looked like I wasn't the only one with the secrets. I wiggled out and held up the small bronze key. It had to fit something in his office. My gaze wandered the room. If I were a smug detective, what would I hide? Where would I hide something important? His desk drawers weren't locked, and I didn't see any trunks or strong boxes lying around. Finally, settling on what looked like a closet on the other side of the room, I climbed to my feet and held my breath to listen for movement in the hallway. Enough time had passed, and Derrick or Abrams could return at any moment. Still, I had time to put the key back and pretend I'd never discovered it. It was the right thing to do. I laughed. Who was I kidding? Derrick hadn't wasted a second storming my basement and using what he'd found to leverage fines against me. It was only fair I returned the favor. With a final glance over my shoulder, I slid the key into the lock and turned it until the tumblers disengaged. The door opened, and I swung it wide on silent hinges, revealing a dark, windowless room. It was impossible to see inside, so I searched Derrick's desk for a candle, finding one near the inkwell. Balling my fist, I murmured a spell and splayed my fingers, sending a spark of magic over the wick. The flame caught and wavered as I brought the candle toward the entrance of the room, sorry. Its light cast a glow over the long table, illuminating a cyclone of papers and case files. The methodical order in the other room didn't transcend into this chamber. It was as if a different person occupied both spaces, one rigorous and one erratic. That's interesting. Worn journals were stacked along the edge of the table, their covers coated in a layer of dust. I picked one up and flipped through its musty pages, noting the elegant handwriting inside. Returning it carefully, I lifted the light to examine the row of boxes against the wall. Beside them was a cot with a single pillow. A melted candle and more folders sat on the small table, which I moved closer to, running my hand over a wool blanket. An image of Derrick's poring over case files deep into the night flashed through my mind. How many nights had he spent here? Judging by the tangled blanket and well-read files, more than a few. On the other side of the room was a long board affixed to the wall. Notes were push-pinned into the surface. I held the candle higher and moved down the length, slowing as I reached the end, where a trio of roses hung upside down, suspended by their stems. I brushed my fingers over the dry, brittle petals. The scent had long since dissipated, and all but one turned brown with age. A slip of paper with a handwritten name had been tacked next to each flower. The third rose was fresh, its stem a wealth of green thorns. They'd found Ella with a rose tucked between her fingers. I read the names pinned near each of them. Sophie, Jane, and Ella. My hands trembled, and a bead of wax dripped onto my wrist. I barely felt the burn. "You can't be in here!" Startled, I dropped the candle. Its flame sputtered as it hit the floor, plunging the room into darkness. Derrick's large frame loomed in the doorway. I reached for the wall, hoping to orient myself, but I misjudged the distance, and my hip slammed the edge of the table. The stack of journals toppled, sending a cloud of dust. I sneezed, and my foot rolled over the fallen candle, making me lurch and brace for impact. Before I could hit the floor, hands wrapped around my waist. Derrick adjusted his hold, and I landed against the firm wall of his chest. I'm sorry. His palm cupping the back of my head. "Relax. I've got you." Easier said than done. The low timbre of his voice sent a shiver snaking through my body. How was I supposed to relax with every inch of him pressed against me? A tingling tickled my nose, but I wasn't quick enough to pull away, and sneezed twice in rapid fire into his shirt. The third sneeze rammed my nose into his sternum. Horrified, I prayed for death. Derrick's chest rumbled. He was laughing. I know. I saw that coming. That's why I was laughing. Oh, this wasn't even remotely funny. I'd almost broken my nose, not to mention my neck, and to make matters worse, I was enjoying the way his fingers sifted through my hair. The gentle pressure felt wonderful against my scalp. Did he realize he was doing it? I was afraid to ask because he might stop. I'm so sorry. Oh, it's like, can you be any more damsel in distress? And she's not, right? Okay. His arms tightened around me, and his back, and he backed us slowly out of the room. Bright light flooded my vision as his office came into focus. With with a tilt of my head, our eyes locked, and for a moment neither of us moved. Oh, okay. All traces of laughter vanished from his face, replaced by an intensity that heated my skin. I expected anger, not this breathless tension that hung thick in the air. He blinked, and the moment evaporated. Derek's hands loosened around my waist, and his lips formed a grim line. The anger I'd expected had finally appeared. That's twice I've caught you breaking into something. I held up my finger. To be fair, the first time I didn't actually break anything. You startled me before I could, so technically this is the second time you've startled me. His eyes narrowed, but I stood my ground under his impressive glare. I was starting to think it was mostly for show, and beneath his gruff exterior was something else entirely. There was only excuse me, there was only one way to find out. We need to talk, detective, about how I caught you going through my locked evidence room. I could have you arrested. His threats had no effect. I moved closer, smoothing his shoulders and straightening the lapel of his expensive jacket. His pupils were wide as they followed my bold exploration. I curbed a grin at his comical expression. Apparently, he was used to people cowering beneath his glare, not ruffling his feathers. That all sounds very familiar, but no, we need to talk about whether anyone else knows. He crossed his arms over his chest, putting a muscled barrier between him and my wandering out fingers. Does anyone else know what, Miss Daniels? I leaned in and whispered, about the roses the killer leaves behind. I counted 3. Ella wasn't the first victim. Ooh. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Chapter 8. It's not what you think. It's not? I scoffed and held up the 3 fingers. 3 roses. 3 dead girls. It's exactly what I think. They all have the same killer. One who leaves a calling card. Derek scrubbed a hand through his hair. He looked exhausted beneath his tailored jacket. His linen shirt was wrinkled and unbuttoned at the top. It seemed out of character for him, the same way the table in his evidence room overflowed with papers and files, a chaotic distraction to the perfect shell of his outer office. Maybe he wasn't one-sided after all. I knew there was something, like I couldn't trust him yet, but we're getting there. Okay. He walked around the desk, straightening the folders I'd knocked over. They're just roses, Miss Daniels. A potential lead. Nothing more. Reaching underneath, he found where I'd taken the key and held out his hand. I'd like my key back. It was still in the door. I moved to retrieve it. You don't believe that, or you wouldn't have those flowers tacked uh, up like killer trophies. Who are the other girls? I won't tell anyone, I promise. A condescending smile curved his lips. He studied me in a way that felt familiar. Always searching, waiting for a tell. I promise from a witch. Is that any good? Ouch. His barb hit, leaving his mark on my ego, where other scars lived. You don't trust witches? Would you trust someone who can spin an illusion with a wave of her hand? Resting my knuckles on his desk, I leaned forward and held his gaze. No, but I wouldn't trust someone so quick to judge either. A cynic who only sees what he wants to see. I ran my fingers over his nameplate and spun it around to face him. Like this man. The confident smile leached from his face. He moved the nameplate out of my reach. Miss Daniels, let's be clear. Call me Tessa. If we're going to work together, there's no need to be formal. His hand froze midair. He might have stopped breathing. Had I shocked him into an early grave? Working with me wasn't that inconceivable. Miss Dan Tessa. His eyes closed while he gathered his patience. I had time. Pulling a chair closer, I sat down and arranged my skirt, then hooked my ankle around the leg of his desk. I wasn't going anywhere on my own. When he opened his eyes, I blinked up at him, the picture of innocence. Miss Daniels, I don't know what you think is happening here, but we're not working together. Settle your fines and go. Forget what you saw in the evidence room, and if you don't, I hear you shared a single sh- if you don't, and I hear you shared a single shred of information about the case, I'll have you locked up where no amount of magic will set you free. For real this time. Seriously, what was this man and his jailhouse threats? About my fines, I picked a phantom piece of lint from my skirt and flickered it into the air. I'm short on funds and can't pay them, which is why I'd like to offer you a proposal. His face was easy to read. He regretted confiscating my potions. Hell, he might have regret visiting my shop altogether. Too bad for him. I'm offering to help with Ella's case in exchange for clearing my fines. No. I think you're being short-sighted because of your dislike for me. My dislike for you? He sank into the chair behind the desk and ran his hands over his face. His exhaustion seemed to increase, as if whatever lurked in his mind weighed heavily on him. Tessa, that's not... His voice faded when he realized he'd used my given name. The victory was small, but it was mine. See, was that so hard? As I was saying, his gaze shot to mine, darkening, daring me to finish the sentence. I mean, Detective, your dislike of me aside, I have information that can help find Ella's killer. And unless your intent is to continue hanging roses on your evidence board, I suggest you hear me out. You have information you didn't divulge during our meeting the other day? He pinned me to the seat with an accusatory glare. It's new information, and I'm not sure I would call what we shared the other day a meeting. I felt more like an interrogation. You're observant, I'll give you that. He leaned back in his chair and waved his hand with cool indifference. All right, Miss Daniels, I'll humor you. What makes you think I'd let anyone near this case? And we were back to surnames. So much for small victories. I pushed out the chair and paced the room. Now that I had his attention, I was reluctant to start. Should I lead with Ella's ghost or ease into it? I glanced at the door. Maybe I should make a run for it instead. It might be a coward's exit, but it held a certain appeal. I cleared my throat and smoothed my damp palm over my skirt. Are you aware that some people can see things others can't? Miss Daniels, he warned. Answer the question. Do you mean spirits? Yes. Derrick rolled his eyes as he rounded the desk. Not the reaction I'd hoped for. Time's up. What? You won't let me explain? I scooted to the other end of the room. If I had to make him chase me around the office, I would. I'm not interested in ghost stories. If you insist, Abrams will take your statement and then escort you home. I stamped my foot, anger at his curt dismissal running through my veins. I don't need an escort home. I need you to listen. Just because you don't believe in something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. That's right. The world is full of unexplainable things. If you would only open your eyes, you'd see them. And then, maybe, you'd have a shot at solving this case. He stalked closer. I backed up, bumping into the bookcase. You don't listen, do you? This is a murder case. You may have built your living around tricking people into believing you have some mystical ability, but magic? Ghost? There's no place for them in investigations, and there's no place for you. You're wrong, detective. I jabbed my finger into his chest. This had become about so much more than eliminating my fines and claiming a reward. Principles were involved now. My reputation as a witch, and this damned desire to make him see me as something other than a con artist who dabbled in potions. I can help solve this case because I have a link to the victim. A link no one in your investigation has. You need me. Hardly. My patience spent, I blurted out my reasoning. Ella's ghost visited me last night, and I can prove it. How? He crowded me against the bookcase, but I refused to back down until I finished. She was missing her shoe, a glass slipper. None of the reports have that information. If you didn't find it at the crime scene, then the killer must have taken it. Find the slipper, you'll find the killer. I charged past him, clipping his arm with my shoulder. The man was infuriating. Vivian had been wrong. I didn't need his help to investigate the case. I could solve it on my own, collect the reward, and shove it in his face. Ooh, she's mad. He'd take me seriously then. Maybe I'd buy the agency and use his office to grow fungus. Really smelly fungus. She's really mad. A small part of me, the delusional part, had hoped he might be different. Then he would see beyond what everyone else saw. The inept witch, and unable to rise to her true potential. If I was being honest with myself, which was rare, but did happen, I wanted him to see me. Not the witch, just me. Tessa, wait! Derrick placed his hand on my shoulder. The warm, solid touch and the pleading note in his voice made me pause, melting some of my anger like wax pulling in the bottom of the candlestick. Let me just stop here. Have y'all met people like this? Where they're just 1 minute they're infuriating and the next you're just like, oh. Okay, sorry, let's get back. But it would take more than that. My dramatic exit lasted 2 seconds before I crashed into the human-sized wall. The man steadied me as I craned my neck and stared into a pair of dark brown eyes. He smiled, and I swore. It was the most charming thing I'd ever seen. He had a clean-shaven face that accentuated the square cut of his jawline, and thick, jet black hair that looked tousled from the wind. I could pay my debt with his coat alone. Dove gray, it was made of the finest material, trimmed with gold thread on the cuff and seams. "Are you all right?" he asked, keeping his hand around my arm. "Excuse me, detective," I heard Estelle, the silver-haired receptionist's voice through the haze of the handsome man's smile. "His Royal Highness is here to see you." Hold the horse and stay a while. Prince Marcus of Ever was touching me, and then, just like that, he wasn't. Derrick seized my upper arm and tugged me out of the prince's reach. Oh, God. Oh. I stumbled against his side, and he pressed his hand to the small of my back to keep me there. The move earned him a side glare. "Do you have to spoil everything?" I muttered. "Yes." "Careful, detective. Your dislike of me is showing again." "I don't dislike you," he snapped. His eyes closed and he exhaled a long breath, looking like a man who'd reached his breaking point. I almost felt bad. "I'm not interrupting, am I?" the prince asked, quizzical. "No, your highness. Miss Daniels was just leaving." Derrick nudged me, but I dug my heels in. This was my chance. I might not have convinced Derrick, but the prince held a higher rank, and if I convinced him, Derrick would have to accept me. Oh, yeah, nice one. Actually, Your Highness, I fumbled through a half-decent curtsy. I'm here to offer my services with the Lockwood investigation. I removed a small slip of paper from the satchel at my waist. It read, Daniels, Curses, and Cures, in ink that sparkled when caught by the light. The prince accepted the card, and his thumb brushed the inside of my wrist. I frowned, not feeling the same intimate sensation as when Derrick held me in the evidence room. What a shame. Prince Marcus seemed to actually like me. Yeah, isn't that the way it goes? I read my name and nodded in recognition. Ah, you're the witch. Your mother was Amelia Daniels, wasn't she? Yes, did you know her? No, I didn't have the pleasure, but I remember stories as a child about how she cured the kingdom's plague. My smile dimmed. Little known fact, and something that never made it into those stories. I started the plague. It was an accident and partly Vivian's fault. She dared me to curse a boy who'd been teasing her for seeing ghosts. Unfortunately, the curse was contagious. Things devolved from there. My mother was an amazing healer. She saved many lives that day. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, Your Highness. Derrick's fingers flexed against my back. It almost felt like a caress. I didn't realize your mother had passed. I'm sorry. I murmured. You don't know much about me, Detective. I'm learning. His words set off a flutter in my stomach. Would he like what he learned about me? And why did it matter so much that he did? We moved into Derrick's office, and Prince Marcus tapped my card. Was this your idea, Detective? It's brilliant. Consulting with a member of the supernatural profession is unorthodox, but not unheard of. The sooner we close this case, the better. The kingdom's in a panic, and the Lockwoods deserve justice. I know I'm devastated this happened, and on palace grounds, no less. Is it true that you danced with Ella, Your Highness? Do you remember meeting her? I asked. Prince Marcus hesitated. Yes, I do remember her. I danced with a lot of women that night, but there was something special about Ella. I wish there was a way I could have prevented what happened. I felt the same. It was strange looking back at the choice we made. Could we have changed anything? Impossible to know. Tessa? Prince Marcus paused. May I call you Tessa? Please do. I shot Derrick a look. Oh, I believe you might have skills we haven't thought of to use. We need to examine the case from every angle. Derrick shook his head. It's too dangerous, Your Highness. Miss Daniels doesn't have any experience. The prince frowned. There is an element of risk, but I'm sure if you watch over her, she'll prove to be an asset. Hear that, Detective? An asset. If witches could fly, I'd be in the rafters. I'll do my best to help in any way possible. It's an honor to serve you and the kingdom in this manner. I caught the remnants of a scowl on Derrick's face before he cleared the emotion. Don't worry, Detective. I'll mostly be an observer. You won't know I'm there. Impossible, he muttered. He mumbled. I shrugged. He wasn't wrong. I'd inserted myself into the case, and I planned on being a prominent fixture. After all, they'd need to know who to thank when we all found the killer. Prince Marcus clasped his hands. Welcome aboard, Tessa. If there is anything you need, please let me know. The scowl returned in full force on Derrick's lips. Your Highness, I apologize for cutting this short, but I have witnessed interviews to conduct today. I cleared my throat loud enough to be heard across the room. Derrick clenched his jaw. Miss Daniels, I hope you can join me. Oh, I love this. Prince Marcus winked and released my hand. Yes, I won't keep you. I'm on my way to a meeting with the director. Well, He has all my notes and can give you an update on where we stand. Excellent. Tessa, it was good to meet you. Prince Marcus inclined as his head and moved towards. Sorry, Prince Marcus inclined his head and moved to the door, closing it gently behind him. You could hear a pin drop in his wake. I let the silence extend, feigning interest in the speck of dirt under my fingernail. Since you appealed the prince and got your way, there are going to be some ground rules. Dirt forgotten. I tensed as Derrick moved closer. I expected as much. Think you can handle it? I can handle any rule you throw at me. We'll see. Rule number 1. You're not allowed to investigate on your own. I narrowed my eyes. You'll tell me everything you know about the case, including the roses on the other girls and the other girls. Derrick nodded. Okay. Always stay by your side. Got it. When he moved another step closer, I smelled the scent of his skin and the woodsy cologne that made me want to breathe deeper until it filled my lungs. Rule number 2. Keep your ghostly encounters between us. No one else can know. My friend Vivian already knows, but she's a medium and can see Ella too. Derrick sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Oh, God. Don't you have any normal friends? Define normal. He ignored my question and stated rule number 3. Trust no one. This is the highest profile murder investigation in the kingdom. Anyone and everyone is a suspect. I nudged him playfully in the arm. I bet you thought I was a suspect at first, didn't you? He blinked, his face deadpan. I squirmed and scratched the back of my neck. You didn't you? I follow my own rules. Well, I only have one rule, Detective. When you're with me, you call me Tessa. I snapped my fingers. And keep an open mind about my abilities. No more calling me a con artist to my face. That sounds like 2 rules. It is. I'm adding one. Deal. He held out his hand and slipped my palm against his, like the first time. A flare of heat shot up my arm. Derrick was right about one thing. We were playing a dangerous game, one I had little experience in. Unease trickled through me. Between battling wits and trying to ignore a growing flare of attraction, finding the killer might be the easy part. Chapter 9. 5 days and countless interviews later, my head bobbed into my chest. Did you get that, Miss Daniels? I jerked my eyes open again and caught the notebook before it slid off my lap. Ah, yes, checking my notes, I began hastily. Let's see. First, you danced with Mr. Raymond. He went to get you a glass of champagne, and then you danced with Sir Thomas. You stopped for a plate of toasted figs, and last, you spoke to the Drummonds about the new carriage purchase. Was there anything else? No, that was everything. Let me ring for more tea, and I'll tell you about later in the evening. Miss Lancaster strode toward the bell pull. Unlike me, the woman's grandmother was allowed to give in to temptation and had fallen asleep in her chair. A light snore whistled from her nose, and every once in a while she mumbled something about her good old days. I glowered at Derrick. I know what you're doing. What am I doing? He stretched his legs in front of him and folded his arms over his chest. Don't play innocent. You're dragging me around the kingdom, trying to bore me off the case with useless interviews. You don't attend half of them, and then quiz me on my notes afterwards. You're just waiting for me to leave to start doing the real detective work. I'm on to you. He shrugged. The nerve. My fingers itched to wipe the bland smile off his face. I'd been subjected to nothing but cool disregard from him for days, and it was beginning to grate on me. After the heated looks in our early encounters. His lack of interest made me want to test his patience, get under his skin, affect him in some way. Do you honestly think I'd go to such lengths to make you resign? I do. And is it working? No, and avoiding me won't help. What are you afraid of, detective? My knees brushed the outside of his thigh, and I felt him tense, his bland smile faltering. Are you worried I may prove useful? That you might enjoy working with me? Maybe you'll decide to keep me. You're delusional. His words were strained. And you're in denial. I flashed him a smug smile as Miss Lancaster returned to her seat. Where was I? Have I told you about the stroll through the garden? Clearing the rust from his throat, Derrick turned his attention back to her. What time would that have been, Miss Lancaster? Uh, early in early in the evening. I'd say around 9. She clasped her hands in her lap and blinking coquettishly at Derrick. Oh, for the love of spell books! If boredom didn't make me want to gouge my eyes out, having to watch another simpering female drool over Derrick would. I exhaled an irritated breath. Let's skip ahead. Did you see Ella? The prince? Anything relevant to the case at all, Miss Lancaster? This was insane. Nearly a week in, and I had nothing. I wasn't any closer to finding Ella's killer and collecting the reward. I couldn't very well tell Argus I'd need more time because every witness went starry-eyed in the face of the famed detective. We needed to move this along. Actually, I believe I did witness something. My back straightened. I hadn't expected that. Didn't these people realize they were supposed to lead with the relevant details? The servant arrived with the tea, and I nearly groaned while waiting for it to be poured. Miss Lancaster took a dainty sip and offered Derrick a plate of biscuits. He declined. My stomach growled, but she'd already set them aside. You were saying, Miss Lancaster? Yes, while I was strolling through the garden, one of my ruby-haired pins must have come loose. I went out again later to find it, and that's when I saw Ella. Did you notice the time? I asked. Miss Lancaster reached for a biscuit and chewed it thoughtfully. My mouth watered, and I pressed my hands against my stomach as if it would prevent another embarrassing rumble. It was shortly before midnight. I remember because of the clock tower in the courtyard. Ella was sitting alone on a bench, and she kept looking up at it. She appeared to be waiting for someone. Derrick reached across the table and placed 2 biscuits on a napkin. He set them down in front of me and returned his attention to the witness. Oh, thank you, I murmured. The pleasing scent of shortbread teased my nose, and I nibbled on the rich, buttery cookie, darting a glance at his profile to catch a brief crook of his lips before he schooled his features. Did you see anyone else while you were out there? He asked. No, but I did find my hairpin. I went back inside, and it wasn't long after they found her body. Just think. She shivered. It could have been me. I'm grateful to you, detective. I feel safer knowing you're on the case. Oh, jeez. My teeth ground in the shortbread and ground the shortbread into dust. Here we go again. I appreciate your confidence, Miss Lancaster. If you think of anything else, please don't hesitate to get in touch with the agency. Miss Daniels is at your disposal. Oh, no, he didn't. She pouted and her shoulders deflated. Yes, of course. You must be very busy. He stood. I climbed eagerly to my feet, too, stuffed the last of the biscuit into my mouth. I dusted the crumbs from my fingers and tucked my notebook under my arm. Miss Lancaster's grandmother snorted in her sleep, and I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Derrick led me out into the street. The interview had lasted most of the morning, and now the midday sun warmed the cobblestone. It was one of the final pleasant days of fall. I stretched my aching muscles and turned my face up to the sun. Who do you think Ella was waiting for? That's a great question. Why don't you ask her? He cocked a brow and winked and wrinkled and sorry. He cocked a brow, and I wrinkled my nose at his cynicism. It doesn't work that way. Her memory's light on details. She remembers little of the actual night, flashes mostly. But now that I think of it, she did mention seeing the clock tower. What we need to find out is whether Ella was lured out to the courtyard or if she was a victim of circumstances. A mild breeze lifted the savory aroma of freshly baked meat pies to my nose. Can we stop for lunch? You just had biscuits. Derrick frowned and checked the time on his pocket watch. I hope you're joking. I can't survive on 2 biscuits alone. Besides, you never take a break to eat. It's concerning. I poked him at his abdomen, finding only rigid muscles. Oh, nice. He caught my hands over. He caught my hands before I could explore further. Yeah, that's probably something I would try too. Not that I would. Well, I would. My imagination was doing a fine job on its own. All right, a quick break. I'll be quick as a flash. Don't worry. I won't subject you to eating with the town witch any longer than necessary. He bristled at my tone. I'm not embarrassed to be seen with you. There's a lot to do and no time for leisure activities. Lunch is a leisure activity? I scoffed and dragged him across the street to a food stall. I'm more concerned now than before. It's a good thing I'm here, detective. I pressed my hand against my heart in mocking horror. How have you survived this long without me? Wait until you try these. They'll melt in your mouth. You'll thank me later. The unimpressed detective rolled his eyes. I smiled at the vendor. We'll take 2 meat pies and 2 apple fritters. Extra icing. While he prepared our food, I cast a sideways glance at Derrick. We've never discussed my stipend. That's because you don't have one. My lip flattened, and I reached into my pocket. I had 6 royal coins to my name. How much? I whispered to the vendor. 8. Well, this wasn't good. Cancel one of the fritters. Do you need money, Tessa? Derrick studied my reaction, but I remained casual as my mind wept at the loss of my limited fortune. No, this is my treat. A peace offering of sorts. I slid the coins across the counter. Are we at war? He leaned against the stall, a grin playing at the corner of his mouth. It made my pulse jump. To the death. A witch doesn't take prisoners. He accepted a meat pie and tipped it into a salute. To the death, den. I watched him take his first bite and almost stopped breathing. As pleasure softened Derrick's face, my heart did a somersault. If only someone would look at me the way he looked at that savory filling encased in the flaky crust. It's good, isn't it? You're glad we stopped? It's fine. Fine, huh? My eyes narrowed as I chewed my own meal. You're hard to please, detective, but I'm going to keep trying. To the death. I winked. Derrick choked, his eyes watering as he cleared his windpipe of chunks of meat. He'd inhaled too fast. I struggled to hide my amusement. So, what's next on the tour of endless interviews? Is there a friend of a cousin's neighbor we haven't spoken with yet? Ignoring my question, he braved another bite of pie, devouring the entire thing in seconds. I handed him the apple fritter next, and he devoured that too. So much for dessert. The man was a workaholic who didn't make time for sustenance. I crushed the part of me that was tempted to offer him the rest of my lunch. Don't swoon over him like every other fawning female in this kingdom. Have some pride. Fake it, if you have to. Actually, I have an appointment with the Lockwoods to update them on the case. He licked icing off his fingers. Apparently, my eyes found the activity fascinating. Come with me. You can interview the friend of a cousin's neighbor later. A flicker of excitement hummed through my veins. Finally, something worthwhile. I turned toward the street to hail a carriage. When Derrick didn't follow, I glanced over my shoulder. He was back at the food stall. I'd created a monster. He exchanged a couple of coins for another fritter, and then strolled toward the waiting carriage. Extra icing clung to the apple pastry, just the way I liked it. I licked my lips, craving it so badly. He knew it too. His gaze didn't leave my mouth. Bringing the fritter up as if to take the first bite, Derek finally chuckled before changing direction and placing it in my hand instead. His fingers brushed over mine, sending sparks of heat across my skin. Do not swoon. What are you doing? Winning the war. With a fritter? The rough timbre in his voice echoed in my ears as he helped me into the carriage. Consider it the path of least resistance. Ugh, maybe I'd let him live after all. The carriage swayed over the ruts in the road, and I held on to the armrest to keep from pitching forward. Derek sat across from me, better able to manage the bumpy ride. He eyed my death grip in the amused silence. We could have taken horses. It would have been faster. I braced against the jolt that made my teeth slam together. I don't like to ride. Horses can sense my magic. It spooks them. Are you sure it's magic and not poor riding skills? Wouldn't you spook the carriage horses as well? My shoulders stiffened. Did he have to investigate all the time? The man wasn't happy until he'd routed every one of my flaws. I sniffed the air and peered out the window. If you must know, it's horses that spook me. You're scared of the fastest, most reliable form of transportation? I'd rather walk. He made a sound in the back of his throat. That's right. I remember. You like to walk alone, at night, through the kingdom's alley. It's extremely dangerous. You're lucky we found you when we did. Thanks for your concern, but I've managed on my own for years, and just because we're working together does not make me your responsibility. You are my responsibility, Tessa. He leaned forward in his seat and locked eyes with mine. The depth of his stare made the carriage small, even flattened against the cushion. I felt overwhelmed by his presence, spooked the same way I felt with horses, uncertain what to do, what to expect, or if I'd thrown and have the wind knocked out of me. Are you about to issue another one of your rules? Let me guess. No walking alone in the dark. Well, some people aren't fortunate enough to waste money hiring expensive carriages. I crossed my arms. This one's on you, by the way. I bought lunch. Don't even think about adding the cost to my fines. He inclined his head and studied my silence. How long have you been on your own? I broke his stare to examine the hole in the leather cushion. Leave it to detective to ask personal questions. 7 years. My mother died when I was 15. I lived with Vivian and her grandmother for a while, until I was ready to take over the magic shop. I've been running it ever since. Running it into the ground was more accurate, but I couldn't tell him that. One sob story per carriage ride. He waited until I returned his gaze, and the look on his face struck me. It wasn't pity, which I expected, but understanding, as if he were piercing or piecing together my character and had stumbled across something important. I shifted in the seat, uncomfortable with his vulnerable tug on my insides. Enough about me. Before we meet with Ella's family, you should tell me about the other girls, the ones whose names are next to the roses in your evidence room. I've waited long enough. Days, in fact. Derek leaned back in the cushion. What do you want to know? Everything. Start with the woman before Ella. Jane Potter? Derek hesitated, gathering his thoughts. It happened about 6 months ago. She worked as a barmaid at the Laughing Raven. According to witnesses, she kept to herself and didn't have a close circle of friends. No family I could track down. Her body was found in an alley. She'd been strangled. But what set her apart from similar crimes was the rose between her fingers. The details of the rose was kept out of the papers, but a barmaid's death at night in an alley. He paused for effect. I rolled my eyes. Doesn't exactly make the front page. Ella's murder changed that. It was public, almost haunting in nature and on castle grounds. It's been impossible to keep things quiet. Familiar frustration sorry. Familiar frustrations tinged his voice. I experienced the same deep-seated defeat when I failed a spell, knowing someone was counting on me, and there was nothing I could do about it. No one knows about the missing slipper, except for you. I shrugged. Perks of seeing a ghost. Trust me, there aren't many other perks. Derrick looked skeptical. He wasn't ready to believe my ghost story. Thankfully, Prince Marcus had an open mind to the occult and deemed me. What was what was that glorious word he used? That's right, an asset. What about the first victim? Derrick scrubbed a hand over his face. Talking about the victims was difficult for him. It was obvious he cared about his cases. Her name was Sophie. She was young, just turned 16, when she died 3 years ago. It was out of the kingdom. I was out of the kingdom training for the agency. All the information I have is secondhand. Our knees brushed as I scooted to the edge of the carriage seat. What happened to her? Sophie was the daughter of a wealthy merchant. Her family traveled to their country estate every fall to attend festivities at the royal hunting lodge. She went missing during one of the king's deer hunts. Hundreds of people must have been in attendance. The king used to invite all the affluent families to attend his fall feast. That's right. Villagers scoured the forest for days. There was no sign of her until one of the hunting dogs located her body partially submerged in the marsh. Her hands had been placed over her middle, with a long stem rose tucked between her fingers. How did she die? Derrick's voice grew hoarse. Strangulation. There was a ligature mark on her neck, mud and scratches on her feet, and defensive wounds on her hands. She fought hard. I tried to imagine that kind of fear, those final moments, knowing you couldn't win, yet fight to the end. It left a cold ball of dread in my chest. What do you make of the roses? To be honest, I'm not sure. My guess would be a relationship gone sour, but there's no evidence to support any of the girls having romantic attachments. There was a rumor Sophie might have shown interest in someone, possibly even exchanged letters, but I wasn't able to substantiate that claim. The murders happened years apart. They knew different people, lived at opposite ends of the social spectrum, and there was an age difference between the two. My superior wasn't convinced the roses linked the two women. My superior wasn't convinced the roses linked the two women, and there were times I wasn't sure either. Maybe I wanted them to mean more than they did. Until Ella. He nodded. Until Ella. It's too much of a coincidence. There's a link between all of them. We just need to find it. The carriage rolled to a stop in front of a stately manor nestled between a copse of trees. Tangled vines climbed the walls, spreading like gnarled fingers around the window's frames. Overgrown topiaries flanked the circular drive, littered with fallen leaves and crumbled brick. Nature was doing its best to reclaim what was once a magnificent property. Derrick exited the carriage and held it out his hand to help me down the steps. He spoke with the driver, instructed him to wait, and the carriage pulled off the lane to park. We traveled over the crackled walkway toward the door and used the brass knocker clenched between the bronze lion's mouth. A servant in black answered. Detective Chambers to see Miss Lockwood and her daughter, please. The servant ushered us into the small sitted room. Heavy brocade curtains tied the back with golden tassels allowed the afternoon sun to spill into the polished parquet floors. Dark wood paneled lined the walls, emphasizing the richly colored furnishings. The difference between outside and in was startling. Every surface gleamed, and the room smelled like fresh lemons. I remembered my first meeting with Ella, and how I'd thought she was a scullery maid, but that made little sense, given the state of her home and family lineage. Have you interviewed the staff? I wandered towards the edge of the room to examine the marble chess set. Yes, but most won't speak out against their employer for fear of losing their job. The Lockwood staff are no different. I see. I traced my finger over be- the beveled edges of the rook and wondered why Ella had been wearing a servant's uniform the night of the ball. Had she stolen it to sneak out of the house? Or was there something more there? Detective, thank you for coming. A woman wearing a satin morning gown sailed into the room. Tendrils of silver hair framed her face, slipping from coil on top of her head, where a wispy black veil hung down her neck. Hung down her back. Mrs. Lockwood, sorry for the delay. We came as soon as we could. Mrs. Lockwood waved her hand. Nonsense. We're happy you could make time. You remember my daughter Helen? A beautiful young woman with elfin features and porcelain skin stepped from behind her mother and performed a perfect curtsy. Her her sleek blonde hair curled in lush waves down her shoulders, in stark contrast to her fitted black gown. She smiled demurely at Derrick and blinked heavily fringed green eyes. Detective, it's a pleasure to see you again. Our first meeting was under such horrid circumstances. I hope you'll forgive my actions. A blush infused her cheeks. You were most kind to comfort me the way you did. Her sugar-sweet disposition made my teeth ache, and I narrowed a look at Derrick. Comfort her? Must be great to be a detective. Derrick shook his head. You're forgiven, Miss Lockwood. Grief makes people act in ways they don't expect. A sly glint flashed in Helen's eyes before she cast them downward in display of modesty. You're too kind, detective. I fought and barely won against the urge to roll my eyes and move between them. The flattery followed us wherever we went. I cleared my throat. Derrick pressed his hands against the small of my back, and my irritation melted. At least he hadn't forgotten I existed completely. Ladies, let me introduce you to Tessa Daniels. She'll be assisting me in the investigation. Helen sent me a frosty glare. She wasn't pleased with the competition. Not that I thought of myself as competition. I just didn't like the way she was ogling Derrick. This was a murder investigation, not a matchmaking soiree. Miss Daniels, welcome to our home. As you can imagine, it's a difficult time for us. Our poor Ella, we miss her terribly. Miss Lockwood dabbed an embroidered handkerchief under her eyes. How could something like this happen? She didn't even want to attend the ball, and I insisted on staying home. And insisted on staying home. Why do you think she changed her mind? I asked. Who knows? The girl was impulsive, always jumping without looking. Took after her father. I fear that trait made her cross paths with the killer. Are there any leads, detective? I know how anxious you are for information, but we're still interviewing guests as well as examining the scene. As soon as we have something concrete to share, we will. I want you both to know that Ella's case is the agency's top priority. Thank you, detective. Since we're here and Miss Daniels is a late addition to the case, would you mind if we take a walk through Ella's room? A fresh set of eyes can only help. Of course, we haven't touched a thing. Please follow me. Miss Lockwood swept from the sitting room and up a large curved staircase. I trailed behind, scoffing quietly at the way Helen captured Derrick's arm to climb the steps. Spare me the sight of an able-bodied woman needing help up a set of stairs. It's one foot in front of the other, lady. Even a witch can do it. Look, no hands. I glared a hole into Derek's back, hoping he could feel it. But when he probed the spot with his fingers, I glanced over his shoulder. I dropped my gaze to feign interest in the decorative handrail. At the top of the steps, Helen stumbled on the edge of the carpet, forcing Derek to catch her. She murmured a thank you, clinging to his forearm like a squirrel around a tree branch. Derek removed her hands, set her away from him, and continued down the hall, placing a fist on her hip. She huffed and hurried along. What a piece of work. They turned left, disappearing from view. I lingered to let the temper cool, to let my temper cool. I needed to focus on the investigation and not on watching Helen flirt with Derek, which only made me want to stick a needle into a doll of her likeness. Realizing I was lagging behind and didn't know the layout of the house, I hurried around the corner but came to an abrupt stop in an empty hallway. It branched off in multiple directions before a second staircase led to another floor. Blast! Which way to Hella's room? I listened, hoping to hear their voices, but the house was eerily quiet. A door creaked. Faster than I could process, something slipped through the gap. My breath fogged around my lips as a sudden chill gripped the hall. The last time this happened, Ella had appeared. An instinctual pull drew me closer to the door. Derek would be annoyed if I went off alone, but I had to go where Ella wanted to take me. It seemed that way. It seemed that that was this way. I was going to have to investigate a bit on my own. So much for rule number one. All right, I think we're going to stop there. Until tomorrow or the next day, thank you for joining me. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And leave me a comment. Let me know what you're thinking. Talk to you later. Bye.